Thanks, everybody. That was a great introduction. Sounds like I have no free time, which I don't, but it's really delightful for me to be with you today and to tell you a little bit about one of our research projects. Can you?
You got to get closer.
Can you hear? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stand super close. Maybe I'll put this down a little bit so you can. Okay. That better? No.
I'll see if we can raise the game.
All right, in the meantime, I will try to talk as loud as possible. I don't know how you normally do this, but I'm happy for you to ask me questions as we go or save them all for the end, whatever you like to do. I want to start off and do a little first half talking about natural history of bees, and then the second part about a particular research project related to restoration of bee habitats, mostly including floral resources. So most of you probably know flowers need pollinators and pollinators need flowers. So this is a mutualistic interaction between these two groups where the plants really need the bees to be their footsteps, or more like their wing beats, to move their pollen someplace else because they can't get up and walk around and mate. Where the pollinators really need the nectar and the pollen in order to reproduce and make their own babies. From an agricultural standpoint, insect pollination is super important. I don't know about you, but I'd much rather eat that strawberry on the left side than either of the two on the right. About 90% of all flowering plant species require insects to some degree or other animal pollinators to help them reproduce, make seed, make fruits. Some, like strawberries, can do a little bit of reproduction just on their own. So with wind or by themselves, self-pollinating, but they're not always very successful. And as you also likely know, you might have heard the statistic before, insect pollination is needed for about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat. And this one bite is not any old bite. This is the colorful bite, the nutritious bite, the every fruit, vegetable kind of bite that you're thinking about. The types of foods that you eat that don't require insects are things like wheat and rice and corn, the kind of blah starches, but necessary, but not as colorful as the ones that need pollination. And then indirectly, our animals that we eat for food require plants that need pollination. So things like meat and dairy, and as well as wood and fibers and things like that, also either directly or indirectly require insect pollination. So outside of agricultural systems, natural ecosystems also really need insect pollination. So wildflowers, bushes, trees, the plants themselves, as well as the habitats that those plants provide for other animals and the foods that those plants provide can be really critical, as well as the role that those plants play in soil and water conservation. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of pollinators. Bees are considered to be the most important. So we're going to kind of leave aside the flies, the butterflies, as well as animals, mammals, birds that are also pollinators. So those we're just going to put off to the side. They're important, but we're going to focus on bees because they do have specific adaptations that make them particularly good pollinators. They are fuzzy. That fuzziness is important because that is what captures a lot of the pollen that they then go on and put on the stigmas of other flowers. You might not know this. I should have given this as a trivia question, but there's a lot of species of bees, about 30,000 species worldwide. It's a big number, right? About 4,000 native species of bees in North America, and I did a little digging to try and find out how many species you have here in Wyoming. Consensus seems to be about 700 to 800. This isn't known because bees are not well sampled, so we don't have a specific number for you. Just like in Montana, where I am, we don't know exactly how many species there are. Probably up to 1,000 because of the different types of habitats that Montana has. So that's a lot of species. I really like this photo here on the right because it shows the largest and the smallest species in North America. So you can see that they span a huge range in size, right? And certain size bees are better for pollinating different plants, and big bees are, might pollinate a different variety. So these traits tend to be pretty important for when we're thinking about who can pollinate what plant species. Just for one brief moment, I will talk about honeybees because I'm kind of anti-honeybee. That might be controversial. They are considered by some to be the world's most important pollinator. They are not at all native to North America. So honeybees are European. We brought them here for agriculture. By all systems, they're considered livestock, so they're regulated in that way. We don't find very many feral colonies of honeybees here because they're only existing in the boxes that we provide for them. But they do have some benefits, so they're social, which means that they can reach really high numbers, which is why we use them for agriculture, because their abundance can make them, that they sort of make up with numbers what they lack in efficiency. So they're kind of crummy pollinators, but there are so many of them that you end up with pollination services. And one of the reasons that they're reasonably good pollinators is that they can communicate to each other. So the waggle dance you might have heard of, they can communicate to their sisters, where to go to get the nectar, the pollen. So they can tell each other where the best places to go are. Like I mentioned, they're not native to North America. And so, like many of the things that we do, we mess things up. But honeybees generally influence the way native bees forage because the honeybees can deplete local floral resources. So if you're one of those people that really wants to keep honeybees, I'm cool with that, but I just want you to be aware that you're going to need to plant lots and lots of flowers if you also want to support the native bees alongside of them. I love this little image of the Egyptian hieroglyphs over here. So in that part of the world, people have been using honeybees for a long time. Ancient Egyptians floated honeybee colonies up and down the Nile River. They didn't really understand how pollination worked, but they knew that the presence of bees was good for their crops, and so they would move the bees up and down the river to where the locally blooming crops were available to enhance that production. I mean, presumably even Albert Einstein knew that honeybees or bees, can't really tell from that picture what kind of bee that is, but knowing that they're important. One of the things for our work, sometimes we work in wilderness and we hardly ever see honeybees there, mostly because people are not putting colonies out in those areas. And so if we're trying to isolate the effects of honeybees, a comparison between wilderness and someplace else can be informative. I will soon get off my soapbox about honeybees, but for just one more minute, thinking about conservation of native bees, which is what I'm mostly thinking about, mostly what we find is that conserving honeybees is not the same as and doesn't help conserving wild native populations of pollinators, and that's been shown in a lot of different systems. This is a pretty cool image of some limited even native bee diversity. There's a lot of sizes, a lot of colors. They're really beautiful. I encourage you to check out a collection whenever you can. Just as an aside, this image was taken by Sam Droege, who runs a bee identification and investigation lab out of the USGS, and that's one of the programs that's on the chopping block from the federal government right now. And his lab has been one of the most influential groups that we know about doing work on native bee diversity. I'm going to go into a tiny bit of detail about some groups of native bees, just to give you an idea of the kinds of lifestyles and habitats that they have and how we kind of categorize. So if this is, old hat to you, bear with me for just a little bit. Generally, native bees are either social or solitary. We often think about bees as social, but that's a pretty small group. About 10% of species are social. So those that live in colonies and have a queen, that's the minority. The other 90% of species are solitary. So it's just one mama laying her eggs, doing her thing all by herself. And of those 90% of solitary bees, most nest in the ground. So about 70% nest in the ground. And then the other 30% of those solitary bees are cavity nesting. So they find some wood or some other little cavity to nest in. You might be familiar with bumblebees. This is a broad group that includes many species that are big, they're fuzzy, they're generally generalists, meaning that they can forage off a lot of different kinds of flowers. They are often identified based on their coloration, so you can look at their backs, their abdomens, and see the different color patterns to help figure out what species they are. They're specialized in terms of the fact that they have this little, what's called a pollen basket on their leg. So this little area right here, that's where they pack the pollen in when they're at a flower in order to bring that pollen back to the colony. Across the U.S., there's about 46 species that we know about of bumblebees, and almost half of those are found here in Wyoming. Thinking about how they live, I don't know if you have noticed some big buzzing bees this time of year. They sort of go around like this, and this is like a nest searching behavior. They're looking for a little place. These are queens that have overwintered. They're looking for a place to set up their nest. And so once they find a place, it's often an old mouse den. They will set up shop. They make a little thing called a honey pot. That's this right here. It's like a store for them, so they do produce some wax. And then they start making workers. They've already been inseminated the previous fall. Once they start making workers, the queens don't leave the nest. You don't see them anymore. You mostly just see them around this time of year. And then the workers go out and start foraging on flowers. Towards the end of the summer, the queen will make new queens. And which are these the big cells here are the big new queens, which then leave the nest, mate with males who are, alive for a short period, and then they die. And then those mated queens look for an overwintering site. It's called a hibernaculum. So they mated, inseminated, they find a place to wait out the winter. It's different than the place that's their nest. Just a couple more groups here that I wanted to touch on, because you might be familiar with some of the signs of leaf-cutting bees, which make these characteristic semicircular cuts, in the leaves. And that's because they have these giant mandibles. They can cut these nice nice semicircles. And they use those leaves to wall off little cells inside their nest, and in each cell they gather a bunch of nectar and pollen. They lay one egg on top, and then they move on, they make another cell out of these leaves, and they make a ball of nectar and pollen, lay an egg, and they sort of do this in a long line with all of their offspring. Related to these leaf-cutting bees are mason bees, and they do a similar thing, but instead of using leaves, they collect mud, and they use that mud to make these little cells that protect their developing offspring. I think this is the last group that I wanted to touch on here. The halictid bees, they are one of the more common kinds of bees. They nest in the soil, sometimes also in grass. So bare ground can be really important to have in your gardens. Without anything growing on it, they often find these areas, and instead of the little cells made by the leaf cutters or they have these little, each cell in their own little spot in the ground, but with one entrance up at the top. You might have heard that some native bee species are in decline. This is an image here of the western bumblebee, which is known to be declining across the western states. One of the ways you can identify it is one of the only bees that has a little white bum. So it's got white fuzz on the end of its abdomen there. This is one of those species that's petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and that act in itself is kind of under attack right now, and it's where the sort of legal status of this is at is uncertain at this time. Some of the things that we know that contribute to pollinator declines, not just of the western bumblebee, but sort of generally speaking across pollinators, pathogens, and where honeybees come into this is sometimes the honeybees will transfer pathogens to flowers where native bees will pick up those pathogens. So different species of native and non-native bees can share the same pathogens. Pesticides and herbicides, generally not good. That's like a broad brush kind of approach. Land use change and habitat loss, which is where we come in terms of providing as many floral resources and good habitats across the landscape as we can in our own yards or wherever you live. Changes in disturbance regimes, those could range widely. Invasive plants, this is spotted knapweed. Often they might provide floral resources at a time of year that other species might not, but also they take up space that native plants could have potentially occupied. And so sometimes the net effects, positive, negative, sort of how those play out can be kind of unintuitive. So not always a straightforward answer there. And then climate change can mess with different species phenologies, so the time at which plants or bees become active and whether the bees can find flowers of the type that they're looking for at the time of year that they're looking for them. So this brings us to this idea of habitat restoration, and I get asked this question all the time. If I'm going to plant something, what is the best seed mix for me to use if I want to encourage pollinators? Most of the restoration mixes that you can purchase or that are used at broad scales by state, local, federal agencies are grasses. You probably might have noticed this. There's a new development going up near you. They revegetate, and it's mostly grasses. Sometimes there's like 1 or 2 flowering plants in there. Part of that is monetary. Grass seed is easier to grow and collect compared to native plant seed. And so that's a reasonable consideration. But if you have a limited resources and you want the best sort of bang for your buck, people want to know which plants should I include. And so we started off with this kind of focal list of forb and shrub species that that span a variety of traits, of different sort of characteristics. And I want to highlight two people that were involved in this work. Justin Runyon, who is a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service, as well as Will Glennie. He was a PhD student that was advised by Justin and myself. And a lot of this work that I'll talk about was related to Will's PhD dissertation. So we started off with this list, but it's clearly not comprehensive. What on this species, which of these species could be good, which don't we need? Sort of how do we sort of started to think about how we could best address this question. And so we decided we could approach this from a few different kind of axes. We wanted to know how many bee species visited each of those flower species. So that would tell us, diversity-wise, which plants are important. And then how frequently are the flowers visited? So are there particular plant species that, on a per flower basis, the bees are just visiting. And this is kind of a characteristic network that we see, where certain flower species, like the pink one, are visited by a lot of bee species, including specialist bees. So specialists would be the green bee that only visits one of the plant species. Whereas the yellow flower over there is like, nah, it's not that great. It's only visited by one bee. And that bee that visits it visits all of them. So, okay, if we have to decide, we'd pick the pink one as the most important of those three. Does that make sense? Okay. Another thing that restoration mixes should think about is when the plants bloom. Many bee species, like bumblebees, are active across the whole summer. You see them for the first time in May, and you see them all throughout the summer until September. Other bee species are only active for a couple weeks. They're pretty quick, and so there needs to be something for bees all throughout the season. And we want to think about early, middle, late season and fill that whole time period with species. We also want to think about different sites across the landscape and whether or not different habitat types might support different bee species and different floral species as well. And so to sort of get at some of these questions, we identified 63 sites on the Helena, Lewis and Clark National Forest, which is in Montana. And we identified populations of each of those focal species of plants. And we collected, we timed, we would identify that population, we'd watch them for a certain amount of time, and we'd collect the bees that visit those flowers. We did this over 2 different years, and we looked at how long each of the species bloomed, and how common those plant species were across space, so across these different habitat types. And one of the things that we wanted to do was make these data easily interpretable and accessible. So we made something called a pollinator scorecard that incorporated all of these different pieces of data. So it incorporated how many bee species visited a flower, what the visitation rate was like, how many specialist bee species a plant would support, how long the plant species bloomed, and then how common those plants were found across different sites. And we also looked at bee visitation to non-focal plant species, so other species that weren't on that list, because we wanted to make sure that we, were thinking about this holistically. So this is just a kind of graphical vision of of our different sites. They were spread across the Big Belts and the Little Belt Mountains, as well as just outside of Helena, which is over here, in case you're there's our state capital, out in the middle of forest. We collected about 3,500 bees, which is not anybody's favorite thing to kill bees, but right now that's the best way to identify what species they are. They need to be pinned and identified by an expert taxonomist. We collected 246 different species off of the plants that we observed. So quite a big diversity. So thinking about pollinator richness, so how many different species of bees visited these different plants? I've highlighted the top 5. So in rank order, we've got woods rose, red osier dogwood, showy fleabane, Bebb's willow, and a phacelia, which is called silverleaf scorpion weed. So these were the top species in terms of supporting the most bee species. We get a whole different suite of plants if we look at pollinator visitation rates. The most popular were kinnikinnick and snowberry. And there's sort of another, it's much more skewed. There's this whole long list that don't get visited very often. If you've ever watched a single flower waiting for a bee to visit, it's like the most boring job in the world, but important, but boring. In terms of what the most common plants were across the landscape, yarrow takes the prize. Everybody's most boring pollinator plant here. Yarrow is very common and not very popular in terms of who visits it and how often. This is our documentation of the different bloom periods. So we sort of organize them into early, mid, and late season. So we've got some that bloom sort of in early spring, some that bloom in midsummer, and those that are more common later on in the summer. And so what we want to do is put all of this information together to come up with our recommendation for what the most important species might be to include in a restoration mix. So just to give you a sense of the specialist bee, popular plants for specialist bees, we've got willow, that phacelia again, different asters, red osier dogwood, so supporting different numbers of specialist bees. They're organized from the most to the fewest. And putting all that information together, these are organized according to early blooming, middle blooming, and late blooming species. And so we've identified in green here the sort of top early season species, the willow and the kinnikinnick. And then in the middle of the season, we've got woods rose, a lupin species, an aster, and so on. So this is a really nice way to sort of put all this information together to kind of prioritize what we might select. And if we're, allow ourselves 9 different species, which isn't that many, 3 early, 3 middle, and 3 late, this mix would support across that large spatial extent about 80% of the bee species that we had observed out of those not quite 300 bee species, or 250. We in particular wanted to take a look at what we observed the western bumblebee to visit, given that this is one of the bees in decline that we're really trying to help out. This is a comprehensive list of the ones that it was interested in. We kind of crossed off the musk thistle there because that's an invasive species that we don't want to encourage people to plant. But some of these show up again and again, like the snowberry, for example, the lupin. So there's some overlap between this group and the ones in the sort of overall seed mix. Besides that focal list, these are some of the other native plants that weren't on our focal list that turned out to be quite pollinator friendly. Some of you might be familiar with some of these species like sticky geranium. In general, asters seem to be, popular among the pollinators, wild strawberry, for example. So there's a lot of other options as well. So kind of putting all of this together, we made this little conceptual figure that we published in a place that most ecologists read. So others in my field, as well as a lot of land managers, have access to this, this kind of publication. So thinking about visitation rate, this top panel is an estimate of how attractive the plants are. Thinking about plant species that support a wide range of diverse bees. Thinking about those floral resources that can help species of conservation concern, like the western bumblebee. Thinking about when they bloom in the season to make sure we have some that cover the whole time period. And then, of course, we've got to think about logistics. So, are seeds available? Do they germinate without watering? You know, do you have to drill the seed, or can you just throw them out onto the ground and they'll do well? And so thinking about those that are also able to establish in kind of harsh, dry sites could also be very important for getting these kinds of plants to grow. So pollinator friendliness was pretty variable across different plant species. The scorecards so far have been really well liked among land managers as well, and you can easily kind of adapt these kinds of ideas to your own area. So thinking about the whole summer, making sure you have something blooming now and in a couple weeks and towards the end of the season. Thinking about plant species that aren't available for revegetation. So a lot of plant species aren't being grown for seed. So especially those plants that might support species of conservation concern, like the western bumblebee, are things that we're suggesting to our plant materials center, for example, that grows these kinds of plants. So you could think about these methods for any kind of seed mix for pollinator restoration on public lands or private lands. If you're interested in accessing this all of this information, we published a Forest Service publication, which is available for download here. You can download the whole thing. This is what the cover looks like. And so it has all of this information in it with all the lists of the different plant species. So you could easily access that if you were interested. Just briefly, a lot of people helped with this project. It got a substantial amount of funding, and we had input from the Forest Service to help us design the experiment so that the seed mixes would also be useful for their restoration projects. We had help with plant identification, especially grasses. Those are really hard. And with bee identification, which is a really specialized field, as well as help from many other grad students and undergraduates who helped with field work. So I left plenty of time for questions. I could go on, but I won't. So if things come up, I have some more slides here, but I'm hoping that you will have a lot of questions to ask as well. So thanks very much. This was really fun for me. I hope it was informative for you. So thanks.
Oh, good.
I have a question.